43 horsepower. That's less than a modern riding lawnmower. Yet this underpowered French economy car with a death wish suspension system dominated European rally racing and sold over 2 million units worldwide. This is the story of how the Renault Dauphine became one of history's most unlikely motorsport champions. Picture this. It's January 1958, and the Monte Carlo Rally, Europe's most prestigious motorsport event, is underway. The starting grid reads like a who's who of automotive performance. Mercedes-Benz 220 SEs with their sophisticated fuel injection, Jaguar Mark 7s with their race-bred straight-six engines, Austin Healey 106s pumping out triple the power of their French competitors. And there, looking completely out of place among these thoroughbreds, sits a tiny Renault Dauphine. 4 cylinders, 845 cubic centimeters, 43 horsepower. The smart money wasn't just betting against it, they were laughing at it. The Renault Dauphine wasn't supposed to be a rally car. It wasn't even supposed to be exciting. This was Renault's answer to the Volkswagen Beetle, a people's car for post-war France that prioritized economy over everything else. But hidden beneath its dumpy bodywork and anemic power output was a secret weapon that would revolutionize rally racing and prove that David could still beat Goliath if David knew how to dance. To understand how a car this slow became a rally legend, we need to travel back to 1951. France was still rebuilding from World War II, gasoline was expensive, roads were narrow, twisty, and often unpaved. The average French family needed transportation, but they couldn't afford anything fancy. Renault saw an opportunity. Their 4CV had been successful, but it was getting old. They needed something new, something that could compete with the Volkswagen Beetle that was starting to dominate European sales. The project that would become the Dauphine started under the code name Project 109. Pierre Dreyfus, Renault's chairman, had a simple brief for his engineers. Build a car that costs less than 500,000 francs, gets 40 miles per gallon, can carry 4 adults, and can be mass-produced. Performance? Not even on the list. Fernand Picard, Renault's technical director, took charge of the project. His team faced an impossible balancing act. The car needed to be light to achieve the fuel economy targets, but it also needed to be comfortable enough for French families. It needed to be cheap to build, but reliable enough to compete with the Beetle. Every engineering decision came down to one question: how can we do more with less? The solution was radical simplicity combined with clever packaging. The engine went in the rear, like the Beetle, but Renault's implementation was different. They used a water-cooled inline-4 displacing 845 cc. This wasn't some high-tech masterpiece. It was an evolution of the engine from the 4CV, itself derived from pre-war designs. The cylinder head was cast iron. The crankshaft ran in only 3 main bearings to save cost and reduce friction. The compression ratio was a modest 7.51, allowing it to run on the low-octane fuel common in Europe. Maximum power? 43 horsepower at 4,500 RPM. Maximum torque? 52 pound-feet at 2,000 RPM. By comparison, a contemporary Volkswagen Beetle made 36 horsepower, but from a larger 1,292 cc engine. The Dauphine's engine was actually quite efficient for its size. It just happened to be tiny. The transmission was a 3-speed manual, later upgraded to 4 speeds. No synchromesh on first gear, again, cost savings. The gear ratios were carefully chosen to maximize the engine's limited power band. First gear was incredibly short, almost like a granny gear, to help the car get moving with a full load. Top gear was relatively tall to achieve those fuel economy targets on the highway. But here's where things got interesting and controversial: the suspension. The front used simple coil springs and wishbones, nothing special, but the rear featured swing axles, similar to early Volkswagens and the later Chevrolet Corvair. This is where our story takes a dark turn. Swing axles worked like this. Imagine the wheel attached to a pendulum that pivots from the differential. When the car corners, the outside wheel wants to tuck under the car, creating positive camber. The top of the wheel leans outward. This reduces the tire's contact patch precisely when you need grip the most. Push too hard, and the rear end would suddenly break loose in violent oversteer. Ralph Nader would later call this design one of the greatest acts of industrial irresponsibility in the present century when discussing the Corvair. The Dauphine had the same basic problem, only with less power to get you into trouble. The chassis itself was a simple unibody design, revolutionary for a small car at the time. This saved weight and cost compared to body-on-frame construction. The entire car weighed just 1,400 pounds. That's 600 pounds lighter than a Beetle, nearly 2,000 pounds lighter than those Mercedes rally cars. Every component was optimized for weight. The seats used simple tube frames with minimal padding. The dashboard was painted metal with no fancy trim. Even the door handles were simplified to save a few grams. The body design came from Luigi Segre at Ghia in Italy, though Renault's in-house team heavily modified it. The result was, well, nobody called it beautiful. It looked like a bathtub turned upside down, all curves and bulges with no sharp edges. But those curves were functional. The drag coefficient was 0.42, not spectacular, but better than the Beetle's 0.48. Every bit helped when you only had 43 horsepower to work with. Production began in December 1956 at Renault's Flins factory. The assembly line was state-of-the-art for Europe, heavily influenced by American mass production techniques. Renault could build a Dauphine in just 20 man-hours compared to 30 for a Beetle. The base price in France? 479,000 francs, just under the target. For comparison, the average French worker earned about 400,000 francs per year. Initial sales were strong in France, but Renault had bigger ambitions. They wanted to crack the American market. This seems insane in retrospect, sending a 43 horsepower car to the land of V8s and tail fins. But Renault wasn't stupid. They knew they couldn't compete on power or size. Instead, they marketed the Dauphine as a second car for suburban families, perfect for running errands while Dad took the Buick to work. The American launch in 1957 was actually successful at first. Renault sold 28,000 Dauphines in the U.S. that year. Impressive for a French car. Motor Trend even put it on their cover. But then reality set in. American drivers used to lazy V8 torque had to constantly work the gearbox to keep the little engine in its power band. The swing axle suspension that felt nimble on smooth roads became terrifying on America's frost-heaved highways. Worse, the Dauphine started rusting almost immediately. The steel Renault used wasn't properly treated for salt-covered winter roads. Some joke that Dauphine started rusting on the ship over from France. By 1960, American sales had collapsed. Dealers couldn't give them away. But while the Dauphine was failing in America, something extraordinary was happening in Europe. Rally drivers had discovered that this underpowered economy car had a secret superpower. Remember that weight figure? 1,400 pounds. The power-to-weight ratio was terrible, about 33 pounds per horsepower. But weight affects more than just acceleration. It affects braking. It affects how quickly a car can change direction. It affects how much momentum you lose in corners. On a rally stage, narrow, twisting, often unpaved, these factors matter more than raw power. The rear engine layout that made the Dauphine treacherous in the hands of novices became an advantage for skilled drivers. That pendulum effect from the swing axles? Rally drivers learned to use it. They'd deliberately unsettle the car entering a corner, letting the rear swing wide, then catch it with opposite lock and power through the exit. This technique, later called lift-off oversteer or the Scandinavian flick, let them rotate the car faster than any conventional suspension would allow. The Dauphine's first major rally victory came in 1956 at the Mille Miglia, though this was more of a touring-class win. The real breakthrough came at the 1958 Monte Carlo Rally. The team of Guy Monres and Jacques Ferret, driving a nearly stock Dauphine, didn't just compete, they won outright. Think about that for a moment. The Monte Carlo Rally wasn't some local club event. This was 3,000 kilometers of the most challenging roads in Europe, mountain passes covered in snow and ice, timed special stages where average speeds often exceeded what the Dauphine could achieve flat out. Yet Monres and Ferret beat cars with 3 times the power. How? The 1958 Monte Carlo had unusually difficult weather. Snow and ice covered most of the route. The powerful cars struggled for traction, their weight working against them. The Dauphine, with its engine over the driven wheels and minimal mass, could maintain momentum where others spun their wheels. On the tight special stages, Monres could carry more speed through corners, using that swing axle rotation to his advantage. He didn't need to slow down as much as the heavy cars, and he didn't need as much power to accelerate back up to speed. The victory shocked everyone. Renault immediately recognized the marketing value and created the Dauphine Gordini, a factory-tuned version named after Amédée Gordini, the legendary engine tuner. The Gordini version got a larger 850cc engine making, wait for it, 37 horsepower, less power than the standard car, but it came at lower RPM with more torque. The suspension was stiffened, the gearing was revised, and most importantly, it came with Gordini's racing expertise and support. Let me paint you a picture of what driving a Dauphine in competition was like. You're approaching a tight hairpin on a narrow mountain road. In a normal car, you'd brake hard, turn in, apex, and power out. In the Dauphine, you'd lift off the throttle early, letting engine braking and weight transfer start rotating the car before you even turn the wheel. As the rear stepped out, you'd dial in opposite lock, catching the slide just as the apex approached. Then, and this is the critical part, you'd floor it. All 43 horsepower. The rear weight bias would help find traction, and you'd exit the corner already pointed down the next straight, while your competitors were still fighting understeer. This technique required absolute commitment and perfect timing. Get it wrong, and the swing axles would snap the car around backwards, or worse, the outside rear wheel would tuck so far under that it would lift the inside rear wheel completely off the ground, at which point physics took over, and you became a passenger. French rally drivers developed an almost supernatural ability to sense exactly how far they could push before disaster struck. The Dauphine's rally success continued throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s. It won the Tour de Corse twice. It dominated the French National Rally Championship. It even had success in the East African Safari Rally, one of the toughest events in motorsport, where reliability mattered more than speed. A Dauphine won the touring class in 1962, beating cars that had no business losing to a 43-horsepower economy car. But let's talk about the engineering evolution during this period. Renault's competition department, working with privateers and specialists like Gordini, extracted every possible improvement from the basic design. The engine, despite its modest architecture, proved surprisingly tunable. The cast iron block was strong enough to handle increased compression ratios. Enthusiasts discovered that the cylinder head responded well to porting and polishing. With careful work, a competition Dauphine engine could produce 55, even 60 horsepower, a 40% increase over stock. The suspension modifications were even more creative. Rally teams experimented with different spring rates, trying to find the perfect balance between controlling that swing axle behavior and maintaining enough compliance for rough roads. They added anti-roll bars, something the stock car lacked entirely. Some teams even experimented with early forms of negative camber compensation, using modified swing axle pivots to reduce the tuck-under effect. Weight reduction became an obsession. Competition Dauphine had their already minimal interiors completely stripped. Glass windows were replaced with plexiglass. Steel body panels were swapped for aluminum. Some extreme examples got down to 1,100 pounds, making the power-to-weight ratio almost acceptable. Every pound removed was like adding horsepower, except better. It improved acceleration, braking, and cornering all at once. The gearbox received constant attention. The stock 3-speed was hopeless for competition, keeping the engine out of its narrow power band. The 4-speed was better, but the ratios were still wrong for rally use. Specialty firms developed close ratio gear sets, keeping the engine singing between 3,500 and 4,500 RPM, where it made its best power. Some teams even experimented with 5-speed conversions, though these were rare and expensive. The braking system, marginal on the stock car, needed serious upgrades for competition. The drums were ventilated for better cooling. Harder compounds were used for the shoes. Some teams retrofitted early disc brakes from the later R8, though this required extensive modification. The real advantage was the car's light weight. Even with drum brakes, a Dauphine could outbrake much more powerful cars simply because it had less mass to slow down. Tires were perhaps the most important modification. The stock Dauphine came with narrow 135-section tires, barely wider than a modern bicycle tire. Rally teams fitted the widest tires they could squeeze under the bodywork, sometimes requiring flared fenders. The difference in grip was transformational. Combined with the rear weight bias, a Dauphine on proper rally tires could accelerate out of corners like a much more powerful car. But here's what really made the Dauphine special in competition. It was cheap. A used Dauphine cost almost nothing. Parts were everywhere. The engine, despite being pushed hard in competition, was fundamentally robust. You could blow one up, rebuild it in an evening, and be back racing the next day. This accessibility democratized rallying in a way that more exotic machinery never could. Young drivers who couldn't afford a Porsche or an Alfa Romeo could buy a used Dauphine, modify it in their garage, and be competitive. This created a generation of French rally drivers who learned their craft in Dauphine. Jean-Pierre Nicolas, who would later win the Monte Carlo Rally in a Renault Alpine, started in a Dauphine. Jean Ragnotti, the spectacular French driver, known for his sideways style, honed his skills in Dauphines on the mountain roads near his home. The influence extended beyond France. In Germany, where rallying was growing rapidly, the Dauphine became a popular entry-level competition car. In Belgium, in Switzerland, even in England, where French cars were usually mocked, the Dauphine earned respect on rally stages. It proved that you didn't need money to go racing. You just needed commitment and skill. The Dauphine's competition success influenced Renault's entire product strategy. They realized that motorsport success, even with an economy car, sold road cars. The R8, which replaced the Dauphine in 1962, was designed from the start with competition in mind. It got a proper four-wheel independent suspension, abandoning those terrifying swing axles. The Gordini version of the R8 became a legend in its own right. The Alpine A110, which dominated rallying in the early 1970s, used Dauphine and R8 engines in a lightweight rear-engine package that was essentially the Dauphine formula perfected. But we can't ignore the dark side of this story. The Dauphine swing axle suspension killed people. Not in competition, where drivers knew what they were dealing with, but on public roads. Inexperienced drivers would enter a corner too fast, lift off the throttle in panic, and the rear would snap around. The car would roll, and with minimal crash protection, the results were often fatal. France didn't keep detailed accident statistics in the 1950s, but insurance company data suggests the Dauphine had one of the highest fatal accident rates of any car sold in Europe. Renault knew about the problem. Internal memos from 1959 discuss the swing axle issues and potential fixes, but the fixes would have required a complete redesign of the rear suspension, impossibly expensive for a car already in production. Instead, Renault added warning stickers and modified the owner's manual to warn about the handling characteristics. They recommended lower tire pressures in the rear to reduce the tendency to oversteer. They even changed the suspension geometry slightly in 1961, but it wasn't enough. The fundamental flaw remained until the Dauphine was discontinued. In America, where the Dauphine had already failed commercially, the safety issue became a scandal. Consumer advocates pointed to the Dauphine as an example of European manufacturers dumping unsafe cars on the American market. When Ralph Nader went after the Chevrolet Corvair's swing axles in unsafe at any speed, he cited the Dauphine as another example of the same dangerous design. The few Dauphines remaining in America became almost unsaleable. Yet in Europe, production continued. Renault built Dauphine in France until 1967, long after the R8 had been introduced. They also licensed production to other countries. Argentina built Dauphine until 1970. Spain produced them under the Fasa Renault brand. Israel assembled them from knockdown kits. Total production exceeded 2.1 million units, making it one of the best-selling French cars of all time. The Dauphine even had a second life in some markets. In Argentina, where it was called the Gordini, regardless of engine specification, it became a cultural icon. Argentine touring car racing adopted the Dauphine as an entry-level class, and thousands of young drivers learned to race in them. The Argentine-built versions got larger engines up to 100cc and 5-speed gearboxes. Some are still racing today in historic events. Looking at the Dauphine's specifications from a modern perspective is almost comical. 43 horsepower from 845cc means a specific output of just 51 horsepower per liter. A modern naturally aspirated engine makes twice that. The current Honda Civic Type R makes 315 horsepower from 2.00 liters. That's 158 horsepower per liter, 3 times the Dauphine's specific output. If the Dauphine's engine made power like a modern Honda, it would produce 133 horsepower. Imagine that in a 1,400-pound car. The 0-60 time for a stock Dauphine was approximately 30 seconds. Not a typo, 30 seconds. A modern Toyota Camry does it in under 6. The Dauphine's top speed was about 70 miles per hour, and that took forever to achieve. You needed a long, straight road and patience. Lots of patience. On the German Autobahn, Dauphines were rolling roadblocks, desperately trying to merge while Mercedes-Benzes flew past at twice their speed. But here's what those numbers don't tell you. The Dauphine proved that engineering isn't just about maximizing specifications, it's about optimizing for a specific purpose. Renault's engineers were given impossible constraints: minimal cost, minimal fuel consumption, minimal everything. And they created something that worked. Not perfectly, certainly not safely, by modern standards, but it worked well enough to motorize France and spawn a racing legacy. The Dauphine's influence on automotive engineering extends beyond its rally success. It was one of the first mass-produced cars to use a unibody construction in the economy segment. This technique, where the body itself becomes the structure rather than sitting on a separate frame, is now universal. The Dauphine proved it could be done cheaply and at scale. The rear engine layout, while ultimately a dead end for passenger cars, taught valuable lessons about weight distribution and packaging. The concentration of mechanical components in one end of the car freed up passenger space. The Dauphine had more interior room than cars with much larger external dimensions. Modern front-wheel drive cars achieved the same packaging efficiency by putting everything up front. But the principle, grouping the mechanical components to maximize passenger space, came from cars like the Dauphine. Even the much-maligned swing axles contributed to suspension development. The problems were so severe and so well documented that they accelerated the adoption of better designs. The R8's four-wheel independent suspension was a direct response to the Dauphine's flaws. Engineers learned what not to do, which is sometimes as valuable as learning what works. The Dauphine also demonstrated the importance of incremental improvement. Over its 11-year production run, Renault made constant small changes. The engine grew from 845cc to 850cc to 956cc in some versions. The transmission gained a fourth gear, then got synchromesh on all ratios. The electrical system was upgraded from 6 to 12 volts. The suspension geometry was revised multiple times. None of these changes were revolutionary, but together they transformed the car. A 1967 Dauphine was vastly superior to a 1956 model, even if it looked identical. Let's talk about what it was actually like to live with a Dauphine. Owners either loved them or hated them. There was no middle ground. The lovers appreciated the economy. 40 miles per gallon was achievable if you drove gently. Parts were cheap and readily available. The simple mechanical design meant that anyone with basic tools could maintain one. The rear engine meant no transmission tunnel, so the floor was flat. 3 people could actually sit in the back seat, unlike many modern cars. The haters had a longer list of complaints. The heating system, which relied on air blown over the engine, was inadequate in cold climates. The engine was noisy, especially at highway speeds where it was spinning at 4,000 RPM just to maintain 60 miles per hour. The swing axle suspension made the car feel unstable in crosswinds. The rust was catastrophic. Dauphines would develop holes in the floor where water collected. The front suspension towers would rot through. Some owners claimed you could hear it rusting on quiet nights. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of Dauphine ownership was the community it created. Dauphine owners' clubs formed across Europe, bringing together people who understood these quirky little cars. They shared maintenance tips, sources for parts, and driving techniques for managing the swing axles. These clubs still exist today, keeping hundreds of Dauphines on the road. The survivors are mostly loved now, their flaws forgiven in exchange for their charm and historical significance. Finding a good Dauphine today is challenging, but not impossible. Prices vary wildly depending on condition and specification. A rough but running car might cost $2,000. A fully restored example can exceed $15,000. The Gordini versions command premiums, as do cars with competition history. The best survivors are usually found in dry climates where rust wasn't an issue: southern France, Spain, Argentina. Restoration is straightforward but can be expensive. Body parts are getting hard to find, especially rust-free examples. Mechanical parts are still available through specialists, though some items like close-ratio gear sets are now unobtainium. The biggest challenge is often finding someone who knows how to properly set up the swing axle suspension. Get it wrong, and you'll have a dangerous car. Get it right, and you'll understand why rally drivers love them. The modern classic car scene has rediscovered the Dauphine in recent years. Historic rally events now have classes specifically for small displacement cars where Dauphine can compete against Morris Minors and Fiat 600s. The Tour Auto, a modern recreation of the Tour de France automobile, regularly features Dauphine among its entries. Seeing one hustled through Alpine passes by a skilled driver is a reminder of why these humble cars earned respect on rally stages. There's even a cottage industry of modified Dauphine. Some enthusiasts fit larger Renault engines from the R8 or R10, doubling the power output. Others go completely crazy, installing modern Clio engines that produce more than 100 horsepower. With modern tires and suspension modifications, these hot rod Dauphine can embarrass much more expensive classic cars. It's the same formula that worked in 1958. Minimum weight plus adequate power equals maximum fun. The engineering legacy of the Dauphine lives on in unexpected ways. The rear engine, rear drive layout that seemed obsolete by the 1970s has found new life in electric vehicles. The Renault Twizy, a modern electric city car, uses a rear motor driving the rear wheels, just like the Dauphine. The packaging advantages are even more pronounced with electric motors, which are smaller than combustion engines. The swing axles are gone, thankfully, replaced by sophisticated multi-link designs. But the basic concept, putting the drivetrain where it makes the most sense for packaging, remains valid. The Dauphine's story is ultimately about the democratization of both personal transportation and motorsport. It gave millions of people their first car and thousands of racers their start in competition. Yes, it was slow. Yes, it was unsafe. Yes, it rusted if you looked at it wrong. But it was also affordable, economical, and in the right hands, surprisingly capable. It proved that good engineering isn't always about ultimate performance. Sometimes it's about doing the most with the least. When we look at modern cars with their 300 horsepower engines, sophisticated electronics, and safety systems that can practically drive themselves, it's easy to dismiss something like the Dauphine as a primitive relic. But that misses the point. The Dauphine represented mobility and freedom for people who had neither. It turned ordinary people into rally drivers. It proved that racing success didn't require a massive budget. It showed that a car designed for economy could also be exciting. The next time you see a modern hot hatch, a Golf GTI, a Civic Type R, a Renault Megane RS, remember that the formula started with cars like the Dauphine. Take something ordinary, make it lighter, give it just enough power to be fun, and let skilled drivers show what's possible. The execution has improved dramatically, but the concept remains the same. David can still beat Goliath. You just need to know how to dance. Today, only a few hundred Dauphines survive in running condition worldwide. Most are cherished by enthusiasts who understand their significance. They're not fast, by any definition. They're not particularly beautiful. They're certainly not safe. But they represent a moment in automotive history when anything seemed possible, when a 43-horsepower economy car could win the Monte Carlo Rally, when young men with more courage than money could become racing heroes. That's a story worth preserving, swing axles and all. What's the slowest car that ever surprised you with its capability? Have you ever driven something that proved specifications don't tell the whole story? Drop a comment below and share your own David versus Goliath story. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of racing's most unlikely champions, make sure to subscribe. We're just getting started exploring the engineering marvels that shaped automotive history. Until next time, keep those engines running, even if they're only making 43 horsepower.